In the small town of Brattleboro, Vermont, there stood a mansion that locals often crossed the street to avoid. Its shutters sagged, ivy clung to its walls, and a sadness seemed to hang in the very air. This was the Cavanaugh estate, once a proud home of merchants, now remembered only for the sorrow it sheltered. Inside lived Rose Cavanaugh, a frail girl of 12 who had rarely stepped beyond its gates. Rose was unlike other children. While neighbors' daughters skipped rope and played marbles in the lane, Rose spent her days in her nursery, surrounded by dolls. To her, they were not lifeless toys, but companions who listened and spoke. She whispered secrets to them, dressed them in lace, and often arranged them in neat rows as though they were a classroom. Her favorite was a porcelain doll she named Faith, who she claimed whispered comfort to her at night. To the townsfolk, this was pitiful. To Rose, it was her entire world. Margaret Cavanaugh, Rose's mother, bore the look of a woman who had lived with grief too long. Before Rose, she had given birth to 3 children, each one lost before their 5th birthday. Rose was her last, her fragile miracle, and her deepest fear. Her husband, Thomas, buried himself in rail business and rarely came home before dark. It left Margaret alone in the great house, caring for her delicate daughter. At night, Margaret often lingered outside Rose's nursery, listening. She heard her daughter's sweet voice carrying on conversations with her dolls. Sometimes Rose would laugh. Sometimes she would whisper seriously, as though confiding in trusted friends. Once Margaret overheard her say, "Faith says I mustn't be afraid. She says the garden is waiting for me." Margaret entered, shaken. "Rose, darling, don't say such things. You mustn't speak of gardens in that way." Rose only smiled faintly. "But Mama, the garden she means is a beautiful one. She says it is safe." Among Rose's 20-something dolls, Faith was the most peculiar. Her porcelain skin was flawless, her dress a delicate white lace, but it was her eyes, deep glass blue, that unnerved Margaret. Rose, however, adored her. "Faith isn't like the others," Rose explained one afternoon, as Margaret brushed her hair. "She knows things. She tells me stories about heaven." Margaret's hands froze. "Rose, dolls cannot talk." "But she does. She told me last night that I will walk into the garden soon. She promised it will be gentle." Margaret scolded softly, trying to laugh it off, but the weight of her daughter's words settled heavy on her chest. She looked at Faith's unblinking eyes and wondered why the sight of the doll made her shiver. Dr. Ellsworth, the town physician, was a frequent visitor to the Cavanaugh house. He always carried the same solemn expression when he examined Rose. "Her heart is weak," he told Margaret in hushed tones. "Avoid excitement, avoid exertion. All we can do is keep her comfortable." Margaret clasped her hands. "There must be something. Medicine? A tonic?" He sighed. "We live in a time where medicine is still learning. Her condition is beyond what we can treat." Rose sat nearby, listening with unnerving calm. After the doctor left, she gathered her dolls and arranged them in a half-circle. Margaret overheard her saying, "Don't worry. I am not afraid. You'll be with me when I go." Margaret felt a chill. The winter of 1883 was cruel. Snow buried the town, and icy winds rattled every shutter of the estate. Rose grew weaker, her skin translucent, her lips pale. She coughed often, and even lifting her dolls left her breathless. Yet her spirit seemed untouched. One night, after Margaret finished reading from the Bible, Rose whispered, "Mama, what if heaven looks like my nursery? What if it's filled with dolls and tea parties and you never cry again?" Margaret could not answer. Tears filled her eyes, and she kissed her daughter's forehead. Rose smiled faintly, content, as though she already knew something her mother did not. One bitter night, fever gripped Rose like a vice. Margaret sat at her side, sponging her brow, whispering prayers. Rose tossed and turned, murmuring words Margaret could barely hear. "Faith says, 'Not long now. The garden is open. Margaret gripped her hand. "No, my darling. Stay with me. Don't go." But Rose's eyes were fixed beyond her mother, on the shelf where her dolls sat. For a fleeting moment, Margaret thought she saw the glass eyes gleam in the candlelight, as though the dolls themselves leaned forward, listening. On the morning of January 12th, 1884, Rose asked her mother for a strange favor. "Please bring all my dolls," she whispered. "I want them here." Margaret hesitated but obeyed. She gathered every doll, Faith, Charity, Hope, and Mary, the rag doll with crooked stitching, and placed them in a circle around the bed. Rose sighed contentedly. "Now they're ready. They'll walk with me." Margaret clutched her hand, whispering desperate prayers. But by mid-afternoon, Rose's breaths grew shallow. With her dolls surrounding her like guardians, Rose slipped quietly from life. Her lips curved in a soft, peaceful smile. She was 12 years old. Margaret collapsed onto her daughter's body, weeping until her voice gave out. Servants stood in the doorway, unable to speak. The dolls remained in their circle, silent witnesses to the tragedy. Some urged Margaret to bury the dolls with Rose, others whispered of curses, but Margaret could not part with them. They were the last things Rose had touched. The nursery was sealed like a tomb. The dolls remained exactly where Rose had left them. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret avoided the nursery. Yet at night, faint sounds drifted down the hallway. A child's giggle, the rustle of fabric. One evening, unable to resist, Margaret opened the nursery door. The room smelled faintly of roses, though no flowers were present. On the shelf, Faith lay on her side, though Margaret was certain she had left her upright. The servants whispered, "The dolls are haunted." Rose lingers through them. Margaret told herself it was imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's glass eyes sometimes blinked when she wasn't looking. Dr. Ellsworth delivered his final report. "Her heart failed," he said plainly, but before he left, he slipped Margaret a note. "Mrs. Cavanaugh, the week before Rose passed, she told me something I cannot forget. She said, 'Tell Mama the dolls will hold her when I cannot.'" Margaret read the note over and over, clutching it against her heart. That spring, Margaret began spending time in the nursery again. She sat in Rose's rocking chair, dolls around her, and sometimes found herself speaking to them as though they were alive. One stormy night, lightning lit up the room, and Margaret whispered, "Faith, if you can hear me, tell Rose I love her." The candle flickered violently, and for an instant, Margaret felt warmth brush against her cheek, soft, like a child's kiss. She wept, but for the first time the tears were not of despair. One day Mrs. Bellamy, a neighbor, visited. She wandered into the nursery and scoffed at the dolls. "You keep these dreadful things?" "How morbid!" Margaret bristled. "They are not dreadful. They are all I have left of Rose." That night, Margaret found the dolls strangely rearranged. Faith sat upright on Rose's pillow, staring toward the door as if guarding it. Margaret, far from frightened, whispered, "Thank you." In June, Margaret awoke to find Faith's porcelain cheek streaked with moisture. She touched it with her finger. It was a tear. Shaking, she whispered, "Do you carry her soul, Faith? Is my Rose still here?" Though silence filled the room, Margaret felt peace settle in her chest, as though the answer had already been given. Margaret shared her story with other grieving mothers in town. She told them, "Our children leave too soon, but perhaps their love lives in objects we shared. Rose left me her dolls to remind me love never dies." Soon, other mothers began sewing dolls in memory of their lost children. A quiet movement of comfort spread through the town. Years later, financial ruin forced Margaret to sell much of the estate. Collectors clamored for the dolls, calling them haunted relics. But Margaret refused. "These are not curiosities. They are my daughter." She kept them locked away, wrapped in linen, safe from greedy hands. When Margaret herself grew old, she made one final request: place the dolls around me, just as they surrounded Rose. As she passed, her face bore the same faint smile her daughter had worn. It was as though mother and child were reunited in death. The dolls passed into the care of distant relatives. Though many saw them as oddities, each family admitted to feeling strangely comforted by them. Some said warmth seemed to radiate from the porcelain. Others claimed dreams of a little girl smiling. Stories of Rose Cavanaugh spread, softening even the most skeptical hearts. In 1920, a historian uncovered Margaret's journals. They told of Rose's courage, her dolls, and the comfort they brought. One line stood out: "Love does not die. It finds vessels." The journals were published, touching thousands across New England. A century later, Rose's dolls were displayed in a Vermont museum. Visitors reported smelling roses near them or hearing faint giggles. In 1984, a curator discovered a folded note hidden beneath Faith's dress. It read, "Mama, don't be afraid. When you come, we will all be waiting." The ink had never faded. The story of Rose Cavanaugh is not one of ghosts, but of love's endurance. A child in 1884, with only innocence and imagination, left behind comfort for generations. Her dolls were not haunted, but hallowed. And so, when we grieve, perhaps we too should find vessels, memories, objects, traditions that carry the echo of love. For as Rose once whispered, death is not the end. It is only a walk into the garden.